Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's great to see everybody. Welcome to our book talk. My name is Jolene Lane. I'm the Director for Diversity and Community Affairs at TC. I work closely with Janice Robinson, our Vice President, Lenore Caro, who's our Executive Associate. And we actually have one of our graduate assistants here as well, Quinn Brown. So thank you very much. We want to welcome you to this event we've been looking forward to for quite some time. And just a brief word, Professor Sue, as you may know, is internationally known for his work on microaggressions and issues around race and diversity. Two of his books are here, Microaggressions in Everyday Life and Microaggressions and Marginality is a book he edited, which has contributions from several other people at TC as well. There's a very extensive bio in your program about him and his work and his history. So I'll let him speak more about that. But without further ado, I just wanted to welcome all of you and ask you to help me in welcoming Professor DeraldSue.
Introduction. Can you all hear me? First of all, I want to apologize for how formally I'm dressed. But it's prior to that, we did a taping that required me to dress out of sync from what I usually am wearing. Before we get into this, I want to tell you a brief story about the issues of racism, anti-racism that I've been involved in up to the publication of this book. Actually, in 1997, I testified before President Clinton's Race Advisory Board about the National Dialogue on Race. And we were asked to, a number of psychologists were asked to go to Washington, D.C. and make a presentation on the historic embeddedness of racism, which my colleague James Jones talked about. The morphing of overt racism to what Jack DeVideo, who testified, talked about was aversive racism. And my role was to talk about what the average American citizen could do to combat racism. And it was a very interesting experience that literally altered the way I began to perceive my role in terms of talking about race, because after that testimony, which was filmed and seen over CNN, C-SPAN, and just a lot of different media, my colleagues and I received hate mail. In fact, I received statements that I was a racist, but of a different color. And it was strange to me because I knew the content might prove to be hard for many people to take. It would not be taken poorly if I presented it academically. So when we went to Washington, White House staffers isolated us, the three of us, into groups and had us rehearse what we were going to say, to the point of telling us there were certain words that they didn't, phrases, they didn't want to tell us what to say or not to say, but they were encouraging us not to use it. For example, instead of using the term people of color, they wanted us to talk about racial minorities. That was what the thing. Strangely enough, they didn't want me to even use the word self-esteem, which baffled me. But what was happening at that time was there was a congressional movement by the Republicans about going back to the basics of education, reading, writing, and arithmetic, and they wanted none of this touchy-feely issue about raising self-esteem and having education related to it. But after that testimony, and we toned it clear down, we still encountered really powerful statements from me. One person, like I was saying, wrote to me and said I was a racist, but of a different color, that my tenure on this planet was limited. That to me was clearly a threat, and I began to ask, what is there about race talk that pushes so much powerful emotional buttons in people that get them very upset. And so when I shared that with my wife said that you've spent all your life talking to academics. You know, you're not reaching the general public. You've got to know how to reach the general public. So in 2001, I published the first in the series of racism books that was called Overcoming Our Racism, The Journey to Liberation. But that was not the original title of the book. The original title of the book was You Are a Racist. And I even had images of what the cover would be like. It would be a finger pointing out with the title You Are a Racist. It would be holographic, and if it was on the bookstore or the airport stores, people walking, it would follow the person. The publisher, no, you can't do that. It just will not sell and buy. But that lesson really created in me a feeling of why it is so difficult to people to honestly dialogue on race. And what I'd like to do is talk about this. I'm going to do just a brief presentation, give some examples, and maybe even interact and have you make suggestions or ask questions. The reason I know this is shameless to have my own books here, but the content of what I'm going to present today really comes from two primary books, Microaggressions in Everyday Life, and the one that was published in January of this year, Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence, Understanding and Facilitating Difficult Dialogues on Race. And first of all, I'm going to share with you an African proverb that was taught to me, and it goes like this: the true tale of the lion hunt will never be told as long as the hunter tells the story. And this is one of the issues that is so important about race talk. Because if you look about race talk, we have many examples of racial dialogues that get heated. We don't really have racial dialogues. We have racial monologues. That is that people talk at one another, or past one another. And you can watch this on political pundits, on commentators, who they state their position, a person restates their position, and it's back and forth, never a connection or a true dialogue that happens. The problem, and as outlined by this proverb, is that the master narrative of our society is the master narrative that tells us that racism is a thing of the past, that we live in a post-racial era, that in some sense, if you work hard enough, you will succeed in this society, what I call the myth of meritocracy. And in race talk and dialogues, there is a master narrative going on that tends to have the force and power to define reality. And this is one thing I do want to say that is very important. The racial realities of white Americans as a group is different from the racial realities of people of color. And it is a clash of racial realities that is at play when we talk about difficult dialogues that are going on in terms of race. The unfortunate thing, however, is the master narrative has the power to overcome, to submerge the counter-narrative that people of color talk about. One of my colleagues, Dr. Luann Bell at Barnard College, writes about this very, very descriptively and insightfully. She says that when you look at race talk, the master narrative is composed of white talk. When you hear the talk of people of color, it represents back talk. a counter narrative that takes issue with the meaning that is embedded in the messages that is going on. And this is what you see going on in class when people engage in racial dialogues. And I think we have clear evidence of the importance of racial dialogues in lessons that we can learn from the killing of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, the killing of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner. That what we have here, when people talk about potential bias, prejudice going on, most well-intentioned white Americans don't see it that way, because they believe that racism and race had nothing to do with it. That is their reality that they are attempting to impose on others. Now, we frequently ask this particular question: how is it that the grand jury that came to the conclusion that Michael Brown and Eric Gardner was not guilty and no charges were brought? How was it that George Zimmerman was declared not guilty in a jury trial that was going on? And what we have to understand is that attorneys know this very well, right, Janice? That if you create a reality that jurors will accept, the decision, the definition of the problem, the outcome will support the means here. So that what we have here is that when you go before a grand jury or a jury in terms of race issues, for them to say race had nothing to do with it is a fallacy. Race had everything to do with it. They are in essence saying is that race from the perspective of people of color had nothing to do with it, but white culture, white race has everything and it's important. When you eliminate the discussion of racial differences, you fall back on the default standard of white Western European rules and regulations that underlie jury decisions, how the process is conducted in those particular selections. And these are things we have evidence of this going on constantly in terms of art. One of the things that I do want to do is that I've decided to dedicate all of my presentations that I make this year to Maya Angelou. And many of you know that she passed away in May of 2014. And one of the things that I want to say is that it is so significant to me because I finished my book, Race Talk, at a period the same day that it was announced that Maya Angelou had passed. And it seemed significant to me, almost symbolic, that she was saying to all of us to carry on her legacy, to tell the stories that are most silenced and unheard, that people find most uncomfortable in terms of truly understanding. And I think that one of the things that strikes me about this is that Maya Angelou told a different story, what I call the rest of the story. In her novels, in her poetry, in her presentations. And there is two passages that I am especially struck by that I want to share with you, in which she tells a story that others find very disturbing. Not only in terms of her novel, Now I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, but Still I Rise, a poem that really many of us read over and over to distill the meaning. In this one, she writes this particular passage: "You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may tread me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness, but still like air I'll rise. There are many aspects of this that have meaning to us, people of color that understand. She talks about the resilience that people of color endure and overcome in order to survive many of these onslaughts. She was among the first to begin to talk about what I have called racial microaggressions. She didn't label it that way, but these are racial microaggressions that are environmental, that are verbal, that are nonverbal. When she says, you may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies, she's talking about curriculum issues, that the educational content portrays racial, ethnic, or people of color in stereotypic or maladaptive, distorted ways that people imbibe and take into. You may tread me in the very dirt, but still like dust I'll rise. You may shoot me with your words. You may say things to us. Or you may cut me with your eyes. Nonverbal behaviors. This is one of the things that she's talking about, that the everyday invalidations, insults, put-downs that people of color experience are communicated to us non-verbally or by words. The problem that she talks about in microaggressions, which forms a heart of, for example, our studies indicate that almost all difficult dialogues on race are triggered by a racial microaggression. The problem is the perpetrator, the person delivering it, whether it be a fellow student or even a professor, that person is unaware that they are delivering a put-down message to the individual. And the other thing that Maya Angelou talks about in her book, Now I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, she makes a distinction between hate crimes, what white supremacists, Klan members engage in, and the everyday insults, slights, and bias that people of color experience. She would say that, and she uses the language in this way, that people of color experience little murders every single aspect of their day. That is in contrast to the grand execution that everyone sees and condemns, a hate crime, the killing that goes on. And she is saying that well-intentioned, well-meaning individuals will always stand against overt acts of hatred and crime, but they do less damage to the standard of living of people of color than the everyday put-downs and insults that strikes at the core of one's integrity, that creates disparities or inequities in education, employment, and healthcare. She is saying that these are not micro effects, they are macro impacts that are going on, and that this is what is happening. And she tells her story of the story of people who are most oppressed and silenced in this particular way. What is race talk? Let me share with you a classroom situation or a dialogue, a description when we were, let me go on. The book that came out was based upon a series of 4 studies that we conducted at Teachers College. We identified a group of white students, a group of students of color, a group of white faculty, and a group of faculty of color. And we explored with them what they saw constituted a difficult dialogue on race from their experience in the classroom situation. And what we did was tried a series of intersections to find commonalities and differences. Well, to make a long story short, what we found was something I've mentioned almost every one of the difficult dialogues that they gave examples or talked about was triggered by a racial micro-aggression, whether it be a micro-assault, a micro-insult, or a micro-invalidation. The three forms of microaggressions, almost all difficult dialogues, were triggered from that. The second thing we discovered was that most students and faculty of color could identify the trigger. They could say that it was because such and that was offensive, and on and on. Our white students and white colleagues had great difficulty. They knew something was amiss. They would sense the tension in the classroom, but they could not put their finger on it. So when we begin to talk about the importance of educators and facilitators facilitating difficult racial dialogues, the conclusion is that you can't facilitate a dialogue if you don't know what's happening. And that is one of the primary areas that we encounter in racial dialogues. And let me share with you this particular statement that was brought up by a white male professor. Teaching a class in urban education, I was analyzing brief biographical sketches of Black Americans who described how race impacted their lives and the special hardships they encountered in education. Contrary to the usual class involvement, the responses were brief, tepid, and guarded. It was like pulling teeth to get any type of response. Sound familiar? Silence that occurs when you enter this particular dialogue. Finally, a white female student observed that it was not a race issue, and that being a woman, she had always also experienced low expectations from teachers. Immediately, a white male student chimed in and asked, "Isn't it a social class issue?" Another white female student agreed and went into a long monologue concerning how class issues are always neglected in discussions of social justice. She asked, quote, "Why is everything always about race?" Now, some of you know what's happening. You see this occurring, and I can see by your nonverbal, some of you, your smiles, that you know that this is very typical of what you see occurring in the classroom here. I could sense the energy in the classroom rise when one of the few Black female students angrily confronted the white female student with these words, quote, "You have no idea what it's like to be Black. I don't care if you are poor or not, but you have white skin. Do you know what that means? Don't tell me that being Black isn't different from being white," end quote. A Latina student also added to the rejoinder by saying, quote, "You will never understand. Whites don't have to understand. Why are white people so scared to talk about race? Why do you always have to push it aside?" These are observations being made by two students of color of where the discussion is flowing. Do you see that? Okay, let's continue. The two white female students seemed baffled and became defensive. After an attempt to clarify their points, both white female students seemed to only inflame the debate, right? You know, this happens. One of the female students began to cry, and the second student indignantly got up, stated she was not going to be insulted, and left the classroom. At that point, many of the students tried to comfort the crying student, while the few students of color appeared unmoved. How inhumane. You know, in terms of, and we'll get to this issue. Let's go on with this dialogue here. As a white male professor, I felt overwhelmed with anxiety and paralyzed. I was fearful about losing control of the classroom dynamics and didn't know what to do. Finally, I told everyone to calm down, not to let their emotions interfere with their learning, and to respect one another. After classmates began consoling the crying student, I suggested that we table the discussion and go on to another topic. Okay, let me just get some input from you. What do you see happening in this typical description? I mean, we received many similar types of descriptions of what happens when race talk begins to occur in the classroom. Any of you care to, what observations do you have about what's happening here? Yes?
It's apparently too difficult because the professor doesn't know how to facilitate such a conversation. But I think what's even most offensive is that because the white student became uncomfortable and started crying, that to appease that student and that discomfort and tension in the room, they had to close that conversation when it was just beginning. And I feel bad for the students of color in there who just had to be silenced.
Okay,
and
good.
Continue that conversation.
Good, and that really, that is a microaggression in itself. By sidetracking and not allowing. What other things do you see going on? Yeah.
Let's see the white students personalizing a systemic issue. So instead of talking about something that's happening at a systemic level in the role we all play in it, you're hearing I'm a racist instead of things are racist, and so it makes it difficult to have a conversation because everything from that point will be a personal attack.
Okay. Okay. Other comments or observations? Yeah.
You kind of mentioned that at some point, I think you said like inhumane, like there's this feeling of like when students of color, people of color are unmoved by these things, then they become placed in these kind of conceptions of maybe some sort of stereotype.
Why do you think the two women of color seem unmoved by it?
Right. Well, because either they might occupy some like angry person of color position or whatever it might be, that I think a lot of folks get put into.
Okay, I think you're bringing up something else, that when you raise an issue, you can, they pathologize your response. You're an angry black woman, angry black men, or, you know, in terms of raising this issue, like one person said, why is everything about race? You know, it's an attempt to dilute or, you know, sidetrack the conversation. Was there another person, okay, other comments here. What do you see happening here? What do you see as a perspective coming? See, this is one thing that we began to do. What are the students of color experiencing? What are the white students experiencing? And what is the white male professor experiencing? Because they are all interacting with each other in a way that leads to unsuccessful racial dialogues. In our studies, we find that unsuccessful racial dialogues, in fact, most race talk is unsuccessful. Truthfully, what we find is that it perpetuates biases and prejudice. It prevents empathic understanding from going on. It creates anger and resentment, and it reinforces the thought that we should avoid one another. It leads to that things. But in those rare instances where we find race talk to be successful, there are a lot of positive issues. There's a dispelling of racial stereotypes and biases. There's increased compassion. There's less fear of differences. There's lower defensiveness. There are many positive aspects if you are able to get through this race talk. And this example is so typical of how we both sabotage and are ineffective in terms of a racial dialogue. Others of you, any other observations? Yes.
I just want to say I can imagine that students of color, they're able to sense this anxiety that this professor has, and maybe even the students, the white students too. And if the level of anxiety is already there, when they're just touching the surface of it, my goodness, I don't know what's going to happen when they actually dive into something that actually...
Okay, go on. What is the fear that is going on? You're right on it. What is the fear that the professor has?
I think losing control
Yes.
is one of it, and one of the things, and the other thing is maybe saying or doing the wrong thing.
Okay.
Whatever that wrong thing is, I feel like it's a very hard discussion to have, and it feels like all the pressure may be put on the head of the classroom. And that may not necessarily be the case because people are supposed to be bringing in their perspective, both the perspective of the white students and the perspective of the students of color in order to facilitate this discussion, but it's not happening.
Yeah, I think you've hit upon one of our major findings, that professors fear a loss of control, that this will become the classroom from hell, in which they are unmasked as to how inept and how unaware they are about racial issues. And if they're unable to see, this professor doesn't see what's going on. See, this is one of the things that is important for all of us when we engage in race talk. Now, all of you will hopefully be going out and facilitating dialogues on race, whether it be with your children, race talk with your children, whether with future educators, with neighbors, employers, and employees. You really have to have an understanding of what is going on in this situation. And this professor here, as well, there is nothing, this professor is not mean and evil. I want you to know that. The professor is just, you know, in fact, in our studies with professors, when we talked about race dialogue, they want to be effective, but they don't know how. They feel paralyzed by this particular situation, so that one of the things that is important is for all of us as professors to begin, or teachers and educators, to learn about what is going on, who we are as racial cultural beings. Because I would say, if I was to ask this white male professor, what does it mean to be white? I don't think he could answer it well. He might even say, I'm not white, I'm Jewish. You know, or, you know, there's no such thing as, you know, engage in that. But he probably doesn't understand. And for that particular reason, there is a large gap. What do you think is going on with the white students? Any of you care to say, what is going on with the white students? Yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say that they're at the same time learning about the truth of the students of color in the room, and also at the same time kind of recognizing their own truth and having to face the fact that everything they've learned, the way that they lived, everything they've been taught is inaccurate or wrong.
I think that that's what they fear. I think that there is great fear that if you listen and understand what the students of color are saying, it challenges the racial reality that you have. And one of the greatest fears is that whatever they say or do, and this is what we say, is going to be perceived as racist by individuals. So you engage in sidetracking maneuvers. Well, aren't women oppressed too? What about social class? You're trying to get it away from the race topic, in which they feel blamed and uncareful by now talking about another topic. But in essence, the dialogue, see, where we will, that I've worked with in terms of facilitators, that I find out is that when people say, well, aren't women oppressed too? You know, if you enter into a content battle, you have lost the entire class. That's not the real issue that is going on. And oftentimes I will say, when someone brings, well, so what? Women are oppressed too. I generally will say, you're right about that. But you're expressing yourself so strongly. What is behind that? What else is going on? It's the meta communication the hidden ones that have to be unmasked, otherwise successful dialogues don't occur here. What are the students of color experiencing in this dialogue? Any of you, yes?
You know, like, their emotions are being pathologized while they see the emotions of the white students being consoled and supported. So they feel like alienated in the expression of emotion.
Okay. Other comments here. What else are the students of color? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's kind of like, as a student of color who's experienced something like this, it's sort of par for the course, and I think that's why like the students were just kind of unmoved when the girl started crying, because they were probably used to that sort of thing happening. Like, oh God, here she goes, she's crying.
Yeah.
So now, oh, and he's gonna change the subject. Okay, fine, I'm not talking anymore. You know, so
Yes.
it's.
You know, one of the things that when I teach people in business and industry, I teach them, there's this concept called being perspicacious. Perspicacity is a quality that I believe that women and people of color have developed quite well. That is to see beyond the obvious, to read between the lines. And that is something that has to be seen. And by virtue of the outcome of this, having perspicacity is an important quality to facilitate what's going on, because so many different things are meta-communications. They are not the true issues of what is being presented. So let me go talk about this. Race talk involves dialogues and conversations that touch upon topics of race, racism, whiteness, and white privilege. Anytime those topics come into play in one way or another, we are entering into race talk, a difficult conversation that occurs on race. These interactions, if you look at it, are reenacted daily in classrooms, employment, neighborhoods, boardrooms, any situation where race becomes a focus of attention. And we are oftentimes told that there are that we shouldn't talk about these topics, and I'll get to them very quickly. There are 3 external societal rules that work against race talk, and 4 internal ones that we go through that make race talk difficult. Race talk is generally, these are the characteristics: filled with powerful emotions and feelings. It creates a threatening environment for participants. It reveals major differences in worldviews and perspectives. It can result in disastrous consequences, such as hardening of biased racial views, and that comes out continually that we find. And unless instigated in some manner, the majority of people in interracial settings would prefer to avoid the topic. Now, people of color wish to avoid the topic for different fears and reasons than white people. Avoiding the topic for people of color is oftentimes a fear of the potential consequences of raising these issues. Just like the 2 students of color raising the issue, they're negated, invalidated, and in some sense blamed. If you try to raise the issue with your professor, what are the consequences? You might get a bad grade. You know, even if you're a white student who talks about racial issues, oh, a white liberal. You know, you're put down in one way or another in terms of that particular situation here. Let's talk about racial dialogues from the perspective of the white students. They are experiencing, these 2 students experiencing powerful emotions of anxiety, fear, anger, betrayal, and defensiveness. Now, this is one thing that in the book Race Talk I talk about, that the feelings being expressed are oftentimes very symbolic of what is the particular issue. For example, defensiveness is, why blame me? You know, how come I'm not to blame? My father, no, my parents or my ancestors, the immediate ancestors, didn't own slaves. We didn't take land away from the Native Americans. We didn't incarcerate Japanese Americans. 2/3, by the way, were citizens by virtue of birth. What the people making those statements are saying is that they are personalizing the blame and failing to recognize something that people of color are very upset about. That despite those being true, they continue to benefit from those past historic injustices that go on in our nation, and is not being able to see that and accept it, that is really so anger-producing for many people of color. They are ambivalent about engaging the topic. And for fear, let's say, of being perceived or disclosing that they're racist, they remain silent or avoid discussing the topic. And you, in your classrooms, you know that there are a lot of people who don't say anything. And a difficult dialogue can be brewed in silence. It doesn't mean that there are no conflicts going on. They actively dilute, dismiss, or negate the importance of the discussion, just like the two white female students are unaware of what they're doing. They're so uncomfortable with the race topic, so fearful that they'll disclose something about themselves, that they want to change the topic to that of social class or gender. Now those, by the way, are legitimate topics, as I say before, but you have to understand the underlying dynamics that occur here. They're feeling misunderstood, unjustly accused of being biased. And what we have here is that one student doesn't want to hear this, leaves the room, and the other starts to cry because they both feel unfairly accused of what is going on because they are good moral people. And how dare people assume that they aren't this way? This is the perspective of students of color. They're experiencing a denial and invalidation of their racial realities. Do you see that? They're really experiencing that. They are feeling that their racial integrities are being assailed. Yeah, you're always bringing up race issue. You're just an angry black person, so you're feeling the integrity. They're frustrated that their white counterparts are so unaware of their biases and privileges. Everyone, if they work hard enough in this society, can succeed. You are, this goes to the heart of something I oftentimes like to use about what privilege is. That Molly Ivins, a syndicated columnist, once wrote a column about the second George Bush, who became president, that George Bush was born on third base but believes he hit a triple. No, if you ask George Bush how he attained his position, he would say, I worked hard and I sacrificed. But outside the complete unawareness that he benefited from economic privilege, male privilege, and white privilege. Those are issues that really are powerful in terms of the function here. They are angry and fed up with what they see as white denial and a conspiracy of silence. White denial and a conspiracy of silence. This is what is going on with the professor. I think that you outlined quite clearly. Fearful of losing control of the classroom dynamics and concerned that will become, as I've said, the classroom from hell, in which students tromp out of the classroom, go to the dean to complain about how poorly. Professor Sue handled this, and on and on. Student evaluations and ratings plummet. I mean, that's one of the greatest fears and the talk inundates a college in terms of you as a professor being inept, incompetent, and how you fostered more misunderstanding. Believes that the strong emotions expressed are antagonistic to reason and not a legitimate form of academic expression. Now, this is something that is typical of, that you will hear from instructors. Calm down, respect one another. You know, and don't let your feelings get out of control. Behind those statements is the belief that emotions are antagonistic to reason. We should sit down objectively, unemotionally talk about these issues. And there is a failure to realize that when you engage in race talk, you are dealing with nested and embedded emotions and feelings that say something about who you are and your own values and beliefs. And for you to really be able to engage in successful race talk, you have to unmask and deal with these nested embedded feelings. Because, you know, when you talk about how we deal with racism, anti-racism is not just an intellectual exercise. It is an emotive and behavioral one. And you can't just sit in a classroom, hear a lecture, read a book about Asian American history, Latino, Hispanic American history, and be free of bias. It is the feelings that are nested and embedded that really become important. Attempts to terminate the discussion before it gets out of control and becomes disrespectful. A lot of facilitators, I'm beginning to question this now, a lot of facilitators will say that we have to create safe conditions in order for us to talk about these emotive topics. And these are the things. We take turns talking. We talk about things calmly. You know, there are all these rules that facilitators use. I've come to the opinion that courage is talking about something when it is unsafe, not when it is safe. That learning and change doesn't occur when you create a situation which is safe. In fact, some of the, and we'll get to this very shortly, some of our findings suggest that by making an environment safe for white students, it inherently makes it unsafe for students of color. I mean, think about that. That's what we're need to begin to address and see. What is the outcome? Well, I've said this before, unsuccessful, you know, when you talk about these students in this particular situation, it will lead to a hardening of racially biased worldviews. It creates in classroom dialogues the invisible elephant in the room. Everyone knows it's there, but no one wants to talk about it or touch it. And it affects how we learn and educate. It creates an intolerable and an oppressive environment you know, for students of color who learn that white students and professors can control the racial dialogue. Now, let me give you a particular example. There was a colleague of mine, Akapati, who wrote an interesting article that was entitled, Why White Women's Tears Oppress Women of Color. Now think about that. In terms of the example I gave you, this is the example, Akapati's article, when white women cry, how white women's tears oppress women of color. Now let's look at her analysis. In a racial dialogue, when white women cry, there is an automatic tendency for the focus of the discussion to shift to consoling the person, right? This is what we consider humane behavior, Western European rules of what humanity, and this is really also associated with concepts that we have about womanhood, that they are more, vulnerable, that consoling them is the problem here. First, the actual situation involved in the dialogue is sidetracked when someone cries, and this dialogue no longer becomes a focus of attention, but the diversions ultimately prevent a return to the topic that because focus on the discomfort rather than what might be going on. Second, the remainder of the class meeting is spent on consoling the female student, and by default suggests that she was not at fault because you're consoling them, nor wrong. In other words, what we're saying is that the one being supported is the white female student and validated in terms of people coming forth. It's so natural. I see this happening. Third, the outcome of the debate is likely to place responsibility and blame on the students of color. They were so mean that they made this poor white woman cry. They were so mean, and look at how unmoved and unfeeling they were. They just sat there and enjoyed watching this person cry. You know, those are all the dynamics that are going on. These are not necessarily explicitly stated. They are processed of things that are occurring, and a facilitator of difficult dialogues has to understand the process. And I oftentimes say that the effective facilitator is one who controls the process and not the content. You can get into an argument about what discrimination, what bias is, and someone will ultimately learn, but you've been sidetracked from the true process. If you can focus in on the process, you ultimately will overcome the dilemmas that are going on. I'm going to, the rest of the presentation, I'm going to just give you a summary of this, but the book talks about what is race talk, what is the psychology of racial dialogues, why is it so difficult for students and faculty to honestly dialogue on topics of race, what are the characteristics of a racial dialogue, how can educators learn to become comfortable when addressing race issues. These, that's what I cover in the book. Now, I'm going to bring this to a close and then open it up for further discussion and dialogue, because I want to emphasize what our research finds about the 3 external events that prevent us from honestly dialoguing on race, and the 4 internal ones that is very close and meaningful to us. There are 3 external factors that prevent difficult racial dialogues. One of them we call the politeness protocol. In our society, we have rules, regulations about topics that should not, is appropriate or inappropriate to discuss. And when we discuss them, they are discussed in only a certain way. In the book, I give the example of the politeness protocol when Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were both running for the Democratic nomination. And we had this get out the vote meeting. It was a social get together with a lot of various people. And I was engaged in a conversation with a group, and my wife always finds it very, she doesn't want me to do this, but I made a statement that we had a chance to make history in this country by electing either the first woman or first black president of the United States. Well, someone stated to me, which was a microaggression Race and gender is unimportant. We have to vote for the most qualified person. And again, I'm, buttons pushed, and I'm saying that race has everything to do with it. And I went and talked about Mayor Tom Bradley, an African American in California when he ran for governorship, and how polls showed that he, all along, he was far ahead. And then Majan won the election, and when they did polling afterwards, they found that many people at the last minute changed their vote because of, would he be a president of just black people, or that was what went on. So I was pressing that forward, and as I was talking, it was getting heated. I noticed that a few of the individuals excused themselves to go to other groups going on, and all of a sudden, as I was trying to make the point, that I felt was going to really, boom! My wife's elbow jabs me in the side. And she says, honey, will you get me a Perrier? To me, it was clear indication that I was violating the politeness protocol, that this was not an appropriate, and she, even in private, in no uncertain terms, she laid into me about this being. But this is very common. People make light-hearted talk or conversations about something of this manner. The second protocol is that prevents us is the academic protocol, that we talk about things objectively, that emotion is antagonistic to reason, that we have to calm down, and emotions have no place in the classroom when we're discussing these particular topics. The third external protocol is the colorblind protocol, that that we should be a colorblind society. In fact, in a recent survey of millennials, 70-something% of those people surveyed said that we should work towards a colorblind society. Well, if you understand psychology and early studies, gender and race differences are one of the most easily recognizable things that occur. It's automatic. It's built into us in terms of, so it's impossible not to notice differences. What generally happens is that we believe at some level that if I see color, if I see you as Asian, you as African American, Latino, Native American, I am in some way communicating bias and prejudice. And it's better for us to engage in what social psychologists call strategic color blindness. Pretend that you don't see color. Now the problem with that is that what they find is people who, and this gets to the heart of one of my chapters, which is entitled, "To be color blind is to be color mute." That is, if you don't see color, you don't talk about it, even though realistically we know we see color. Those are the three protocols that are operative. The four internal ones, and I know I've been talking a long time, is that our studies suggest that one of the greatest fears of people engaging in being open and honest about race is the fear that people will perceive them as being racist and prejudiced. And they therefore either are silent or engage in, like I was saying, rhetorical incoherence. They stammer, they stutter, they tiptoe around the topic. They are ambiguous in what they say as an attempt to protect them from being perceived as being biased and racist. And what is very interesting in the social psychological literature is that when you engage in strategic colorblindness, you appear more racist to people of color because of the hesitations, the obtuseness of what you're saying, the anxiety, and the amount to engage in colorblindness depletes psychic energy. because you are defensive and protective. And by doing that, you tend not to be able to engage in really a relaxed interaction with people of color. The second level is that I submit to you that that's only a superficial level. The fear that others will mistake you as being biased and prejudiced. The real fear is that you are. The real fear is that all of us have inherited racial biases and prejudices. They may not be in our awareness, but that, I believe, is one of the greatest fears. And the reason why it is so difficult to acknowledge, first of all, do any of you honestly believe you can be born and raised in this country for all of your lives without inheriting the racist, gender, heterosexist biases of this society? I think it's a height of naivete or arrogance to believe that. You may not be aware of it, but it is there. And that is what prevents people from deeply exploring, because when you talk race, you come close to having to deal with what you internally really believe, think, or feel. And it's frightening to suddenly realize that you have biases that violate your conscious perception of yourself as a good moral individual. The third level that we found was that of white privilege. If you get people to no longer to honestly dialogue on race, if you get them without fear that of coming across as being racist, if you get them to now acknowledging their biases, the other third level is white privilege. And someone, this is an important concept. What do I mean by white privilege? White privilege are the unearned benefits and advantages that accrue to white people simply by virtue of their white skin. And I always give the example that as a African-American pedestrian, and a white pedestrian goes out in New York, raises their hand to hail a cab. They never think, as they're doing that, that the cab will pass you by virtue of the color of their skin. However, my African-American brothers and sisters say that they always, at some level, entertain that as something that may be going on. And indeed, the study by Mayor Bloomberg, when Danny Glover was on a night was passed by cab after cab, complained, Bloomberg ran a study that suggested that 25% of the time, if you are an African-American pedestrian hailing a cab, 25% of the time cabs will not pick you up. That is a racial reality. So understanding what privilege that you have benefited from your white skin, that's frightening to people, because like I was saying in the case of George Bush, I worked hard to get where I am. Now you have to entertain the notion of the myth of meritocracy, that people have worked equally hard, if not harder, women, people of color, who don't make it to the batter's box, that George Bush thinks he attained the triple on. And the last level is a level that is most discouraging to me. And that level is a phrase in this way, that someone once said that the ultimate white privilege is the ability to acknowledge your privilege and do nothing about it. That's the ultimate white privilege. And in our classes, our race lab classes and multicultural classes, we're able to get many of our students to get to the point where they are very aware of what their biases are. And they're in touch with that. But going out and doing something about it, there's a difference I've found out by developing a non-racist identity and being anti-racist in action. And Jack Davidio's work, in terms of what he has shown, is that most people who become very aware of these issues will say on surveys that I no longer can allow discrimination to happen. I would be very uncomfortable if I saw these acts of prejudice occurring. When he simulated a situation where they indeed witnessed bias and discrimination clearly going on, what was the result? On a survey, they showed no particular discomfort, and they chose not to do anything about it. Not to intervene when you hear a racist joke. Not to intervene when you see an employee being unfairly treated at the work site. These are the levels that we find, and understanding those 3 external and 4 internal blockages, that is where the book concentrates on creating strategies and techniques that unlock and deal with those particular issues. I'm going to stop there because I'm really quite tired, in fact. Any last comments or questions or thoughts that you have? My books are on sale. They're really quite good, by the way. Yes?
So, Derald, I really appreciate your work and this talk. I think that I find your work the most useful in understanding and being able to operate on the nitty-gritty of this stuff. I've gone to many multicultural workshops and so forth. I always come away with, now what do I do? But for you, when and I've been using your microaggression article in my health psychology class for many years now, and I really find it so helpful, so useful to get into it. I don't know that we get as far as we should get, but I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Well, I just want to say thank you for your work. I don't need a microphone. Thank you, though. I guess my question is, are you doing any work with TC administration in dealing with,
It's a microaggression example.
Oh,
Here.
for the video recorder. All right. Are you doing any work with administrators here to deal with these dialogues that happen in these classrooms here at TC? Because that experience resonated with me a lot, because I experienced that more than once in classrooms here. And even just in the hallways, being here, if you're the other, is a very daunting experience. And there's a lot of movement now to try to change this culture here. But I just want to know, how are professors playing a role in this? And are they engaging in these difficult dialogues? And how can we have them become better facilitators in these dialogues in the classrooms? Because so many times these conversations have gotten shut down, and they need to happen so that we ensure that this reproduction doesn't happen in our classrooms, in research, in policy, and et cetera.
Yes, I haven't been asked, in terms of doing that. I've worked, however, with a lot of different colleges. In fact, I did 4 days of intensive work with Stanford, and have gone to Toronto and done a number of things. I think that one of the things is that I'm open and receptive to it. It's just that the administration has to, in some sense, come to me. I've offered before, I've been on committees, but it just has not gone anywhere.
And maybe it's up for the students to take the initiative.
Good. Good. You could get me in trouble too, but that's fine. Yes.
Like others have said, I really value and appreciate your work. I wonder, could you, a lot of this, I think, talks about how we as individuals react to race talk and then dynamics when we talk to the other in conversation. Yet, having worked in corporate environments where there's a lot of diversity initiatives, I've seen 2 clear outcomes. And it seems to be less starting with the individual or groups or interpersonal, but the systems. Because it is clear that systems drive behavior. And so while there can be lots of awareness and skill building, et cetera, it seems like a very slow and painful process if you don't start really focusing on the systems that drive behavior, promotional systems, reward systems, and so on. So I know that sounds very extrinsic.
No, it isn't.
And yet I wonder if you could sort of speak
Well,
to the
okay,
unit
let
of
me-
analysis of
yeah,
cultural
and
competence.
I think you're bringing up something that deals with individual change and organizational change. I mean, I've discovered that it does little good to get people to be culturally competent and aware when the very institutions that employ them punish them or discourage them for evidencing those particular competencies. And so when I work with organizations, it is in the rubric of multicultural organizational development. And one of the aspects of organizations that becomes almost untouchable and difficult to deal with are what we call the performance appraisal systems. You know, they're the gatekeeping functions of who you hire, who you retain, who you promote. It's a similar thing here at, for academia at Teachers College, where we're talking about the promotion and tenure system. And you've got to really approach an organization when you work at that level as intersecting systems, where if you change one particular system, it is going to have impact on the other systems, and unless you change the other systems, all the systems that are, let's say, monocultural, will force the multicultural system back to being as it is. It's almost like when we deal with family therapy and counseling. We have something that we call the identified patient. That the identified patient in the family is someone that we locate the problem in. But the problem is that it is a systemic problem. And oftentimes it is the system that is creating the pathology in the individual, and is a reflection of that. So systemic things are important to deal with. Yes? Yeah.
Pass the stick.
Thank you so much for your presentation and the work that you're doing. I just had two questions in response to thinking about how to maybe train or mobilize faculty to allow these discussions to take place in the classroom. And the scenario that you represented, I was trying to think about, you know, dynamics of what might have been going on with the woman that raised the issue of gender, and how race is a justice issue, but yet when you talk about justice, people have different pain points and they resonate with it from their own experience of pain. So I was kind of thinking maybe the girl felt like her own experiences of injustice felt minimalized. I don't really know the situation, but in facilitating these kinds of dialogue in the classroom around justice, how do you keep maybe the issue of race on the table for discussion about justice, but then also maybe looking at conflict dynamics and how people are comfortable or not comfortable with conflict in the classroom, and how professors would be able to address or deal with that.
Well, you're bringing up an important issue. I was thinking that I was touching on it earlier, and that is that oftentimes when I talk about race issues, students may bring up other issues like we saw here, like what you're saying, that it's, what about women? What about social class and poverty? What about, I will agree with the people on that. Yes, you're right about women are an oppressed group, and it's important that we understand that and talk about it. But then I go to the heart. If I feel that their statements is more divisive than healing. For example, there's a difference between someone saying that, so what, we women are oppressed too, as opposed to someone saying that, you know, Professor Sue, I'm beginning to really understand oppression because as a woman, I've been oppressed too. That statement binds and bridges, but the other one, so you have to clinically make a decision as to the legitimacy of where that person is coming from. And that really takes a lot of practice, and sometimes you'll blunder. In fact, I always say this, that we all will commit racial blunders. It's not how you cover up, but how you recover. That really is a key element here. One more, okay.
Hi, thanks so much for your so I'm a middle school teacher in Brooklyn, and I'm tasked with kind of running race talk for the staff. And I've been doing it throughout this year in a number of sessions. And I came here today kind of with the question of like, I kind of see people, like it's not so much a binary of like some people get it and some people don't. I see this, like all this talk is very much like a process. So in your experience, like facilitating this kind of talk, like how do you differentiate? Like in the
You know what, I guess one thing I would, and I've come to this particular conclusion, that parents and teachers should talk about race to children before they begin, very early, before a racial incident occurs, where they feel like they have to explain it. Because if you look at developmental studies about age 3 to 4, children notice differences. But that noticing of differences is quite open and naive. That is that they'll make statements in the grocery store of a Vietnamese man by saying, "Mom, look at that man with the funny eyes," you know, because the eyes are slanted. Or going over to a black man or woman and kind of rubbing your finger on their skin to see whether the color comes off. I mean, they're very open about where we fail is the parents get so embarrassed, they shush them up. And you know, we don't do that, that's terrible. So they you know, are taught to do that. Now, at about 5 to 6, the developmental studies show that children now begin, through social conditioning, to associate negative qualities with differences. From about 6 to 10 years of age, and if you've got to track it, you have to separate out between implicit and explicit bias. Do you know what I'm talking about? Implicit and explicit bias both increase up to about age 10. From about 10 to adulthood, explicit bias drops drastically. Because our society says that, nah, you know, African Americans aren't lazy and stupid, and that's a stereotype, or Asian Americans aren't all good at math and poor with words, and you consciously you know that. But what is disturbing is that implicit bias remains unchanged, despite multicultural training. Now this is another issue that we can talk about. Multicultural training, the type that we have now in our classroom, tends to be most effective with explicit bias. It has very little impact. In fact, this is studied by Vogel and Boyson. It has very little impact upon implicit bias. Now the question becomes, what are we doing wrong in our training? You know, and going back to what, I'm getting off the top, but prevention is better than remediation. If you start pre-K through 12, that's the easiest time to really affect an anti-bias things. But for those of us who have, you know, like I oftentimes say, we may be too late because we're engaging in remediation, trying to unlearn many of the biases and discover who we are as racial, cultural beings. But I think that the question about what does training encompass that would get at implicit bias, I think the training would be very uncomfortable for people. You know that, that film called A Class Divided by Jane Elliott, blue eyes, brown eyes, and you could never do an exercise like that in our current school systems. You would be caught unethical, you would be sued, lawsuits would fly, and I guess what I'm saying is that it is painful to have to delve into what your biases are, to realize that you have oppressed others. It's painful because the image we have is being good, moral, decent people. But those are things, and so that I'm trying to, discover with, maybe another one, what type of training would be required. And I can almost tell you that the type of training I think that's required would not be acceptable in our current educational environment. Anyway, I thank you all. The book is over there.
Well, thank you again very much for coming, everyone. Can we extend just one more round of applause thanking Dr. Sue? My closing remarks are very brief. In the Office for Diversity and Community Affairs several years ago when I came, I began a tradition of giving a small gift to our speakers, and so I'd like to present them with the poster of the event that we sponsored, and so I have a gift for Dr. Sue.
Oh, thank you.
And that's it as well. And I want to invite all of you to a brief reception next door. We have some refreshments, and of course the books are for sale, so please purchase a book. I'm sure we can cajole Dr. Sue into signing them for us, and I look forward to chatting with you, and you'll have the opportunity to speak with him afterwards. Thank you again for coming.